get it consistently right on every machine. And we spent 2 or 3 years getting power management work. A lot of people are literally using computers quite often as single-use devices. I mean, I think that's why you are starting to see the tablet use. Because to a lot of people, they don't really want a computer. They tend to want something fairly simple, mainly a web browser, but you want a few games. Right. Web browser and games, I think, is like the big thing that people use tablets for. That's a much easier market to enter than the free. I mean, you have the web browser. That's easy. You can do that with anything. But you also have traditionally had desktops. You connect random devices to it. One of the ideas of USB was that you could make it even easier to connect thousands and thousands of devices. And that sounds like a great idea, but it makes the market much harder to enter because now you have to support many more devices. Like a cell phone is much easier to support for a company because this cell phone, when you build a cell phone, the only devices you reasonably have to support are the devices that are built into the cell phone. You don't have the issue that a user will say, okay, I will now connect a printer, or I will now take a graphics card and insert it in the cell phone, and now I have to support every single printer they might buy, or every single graphics card, or every single wireless card. So, to some degree, a lot of other areas are much simpler to support for a company who wants to enter the market. The reason the desktop is hard to support is that you can do it 2 ways. You can do it the way Apple did it, which was saying, we only support this hardware, which is actually a very good, yes, and it's a very good way of supporting things. It just means that you're limiting yourself to a specific set of hardware. And that is actually why I think Apple started failing about 10, 15 years ago, because their hardware was not keeping up, because they only had this limited set of hardware, and they didn't have the vibrant community that the PC hardware had. Apple is successful. They took a big risk, and they switched hardware providers completely, and they switched from hardware that was not able to keep up to the same hardware that PC people are using. So now they're riding the same wave, and it was very successful for them. What also happened was that a lot of the hardware had basically standardized. So today, when you get a CPU, you get the wireless, you get the wired networking, and you get graphics, and you have a PC. And fewer people actually need the capability to switch hardware on the fly compared to what it was 15 years ago. I mean, people actually used to build their own computers 15 years ago. People kind of have stopped because there's less reason. So that helped Apple, and Apple's model is clearly very successful. The other model is clearly the Microsoft model, which worked for Microsoft because they had 98% or whatever market share. They could tell the hardware manufacturers, or they didn't even need to tell the hardware manufacturers. The hardware manufacturers knew that they had to work with Microsoft in order to be able to sell their hardware. So what happened was, for Microsoft, all the hardware manufacturers would write their own support for their own hardware and basically give it to Microsoft because they had to do that in order to get their hardware. So Linux is the third model, and the hardest model by far, which is saying, we will support everything out there. Linux actually supports more than Microsoft does. And, I mean, not just x86. We support an incredible amount of hardware, and we've mostly done it on our own. It's changing slowly. Now companies that create hardware are starting to really help us. In certain areas, they help us a lot. Like the CPU manufacturers are very active. In other areas, they don't help us very much.
So you feel sad about the relationship with Microsoft from Nokia?
It's like, I don't really care. But at the same time, I have to admit that it being Nokia it was a sad day when they announced. I mean, that's actually most of the changes we do are not writing new and exciting code. Most of the changes we do are changing and improving code. So I mean, it just happened. This is an extreme case of that.
How many people can do your work?
The big issue is actually trust. I mean, there is a certain amount of technical knowledge. On a technical knowledge scale, there's probably a few tens of people who really know pretty much. I mean, they know the kernel well enough that they could do my work.
So the distribution system is also has a pyramid. I mean,
it does. I mean, there are certain levels of connectedness, right? It is a network, but some people are better networked and are more centrally networked.
Some people has to decide.
Yeah, and it's very much the case that the connectedness itself is a big issue. The reason I'm an effective maintainer and manager is not because I'm technically superior to everybody else in the world. I'd like to think I am, right? But that's not the fundamental reason. The fundamental reason is just that people trust me. They don't necessarily trust me to always make the right decision, but they know how I work. They've seen me work for 20 years. So they trust me the way you might trust somebody you've seen for a long time. You trust them not to be crazy, right? And you trust them that if they make the wrong mistake, if I make a bad decision, they know that, okay, I will say, okay, that was bad. I will undo that.
That's why maybe nobody did a fork.
I mean, no, forks always happen, but I think one of the reasons, even in the kernel, yeah. I mean, the thing is, forks the nice thing about the kernel forks have been we've been pretty friendly about forking. There have been certain projects that when the project forks, it becomes a big fight between the two forks. And in the kernel, we seldom had that. Even the Android fork, which has been like the biggest fight we've ever had. It's not like we hate the Google guys. No. I mean, the Android fork is about as unfriendly as we can get. And we're talking about saying, hey, you were right. Let's just pull in your code. And the thing is, if you don't get unfriendly about fork, if you say, it's okay for you to try your own thing, and we don't believe it's the right thing, but if you prove that it's working really well, hey, you won. We'll take your code. So that's, I think, the biggest change between Linux and some other open source project. And actually, coming back to your earlier question about the whole having a central working group that controls the project, one of the things that makes me not like that model is that if you have 9 people who are random number, you have a number of people who just try to control the project, and then somebody else on the outside is unhappy and tries to take it in a different direction, you get all this political friction. You get this nasty argumentation about who's right and who's wrong. And after you've argued that for a few months, the two groups really hate each other, right? And then the fork has turned from a technical fork into a political and psychological and
sociological.
Argument. Yes, and that's bad. And in the Linux community, we've always had forks. I mean, literally, all the distributions have always made their own kernels. These days, most of the distributions try to minimize their differences to mainline, but that's mainly because the kernel is kind of stable, and they don't see the kernel as the point that they want to specialize.
It's a huge work to divide their own.
It's work and not a lot of payback. So, but you go back 10 years, all the major distributions maintained their big forks, but people didn't think of them as forks in the traditional sense because we didn't argue about it. It was like, that's good. We'll take the parts that work for you. And that's really nice because forks is how new development gets done. You have some crazy person who comes up with a new idea and some way of doing things better, and everybody else laughs at him and says, "You're just cuckoo," right? And it turns out they were right, and they could go off and do their own thing, and then they say, "Hey, look, I was right. Here are the numbers. I am 10 times faster than you are, and I do it in less code." And everybody else says, "Wow,